died of a short illness, but leads with homeowners in dangerous buildings being hit with crippling bills. So Peter Hitchens and Allison Morris here to go with me, go through those front pages with me. Peter, lots of big stories on the front pages, but different ones. Talk about calls for a national lockdown. We'll come to that in a moment. Talk about what schools will be doing. But the other big issue, of course, being headlined in some of the papers is the rollout of the AstraZeneca jab from tomorrow. And you've picked out the Sun on that from tomorrow. They're calling it Jabby Monday.
Yes, it's all very cheerful, isn't it? And one can only hope that they're right. But here we have one of those things that we're used to, a huge, expensive government project involving tight coordination and brilliant organisation. Will it really happen? And of course, the Telegraph is immediately casting doubt on that, suggesting that the number of vaccinations projected isn't going to be as great as thought. It is a gigantic thing to attempt to do, and given that the state that the health service has been in for the past several months, one has to have one's doubts, much as I long, I have to say, for any reason to bring this appalling misery to an end. I'm not completely convinced that it's going to be a roaring success.
Well, yes, and Alison, let's take a look at that Telegraph article that Peter was referring to there. It's the second story, or one of the other stories on the front page of the Telegraph. NHS refuses to commit to 2 million jabs a week as Oxford rollout begins. What's your take on this? I mean, it is obviously hugely ambitious. The ambition is to get up to 2 million vaccinations a week. I think by February is the hope. But there is an awful lot that needs to be done, a lot of people to be inoculated and a lot of staff and venues to find to roll out the vaccine.
It is, and so it's getting the order that people are vaccinated in correctly to make sure that those people who are most vulnerable or people who work on the front line are vaccinated first. And remember, while this vaccination, the Oxford vaccination, is it's much easier to transport. It doesn't need to be held at the sort of -70 temperatures that the Pfizer one does, so therefore easier to get out quicker. People still need to be vaccinated twice. They still need 2 jabs. I mean, the rollout of vaccinations in Northern Ireland is going quite well in nursing homes, but it's still to be rolled out among the rest of the population. And the logistics of that are huge. And we know that people live in some quite rural areas who are going to be hard to reach. We also know that, a lot of people are relying on lists that already exist within GPs and doctor surgeries and clinics, and some people may have fallen off those lists, and they will need to be found as well to make sure that this gets to the people it needs to get to first. And as Peter said, the only way that we're ever going to emerge from this misery into the spring and the summer is if we do manage to get all the elderly people, the vulnerable people, and those people working on the front line vaccinated, so we can start getting some kind of normality back.
Well, that's right. And Peter, just a quick thought about the fact that there has been a change in tack now to widen the gap between the first and second doses of each vaccination in order to try to protect more people and get that rollout more quickly to more people, even if they haven't had their second dose. Does that sound sensible to you?
It makes perfect sense to me. I think if your aim is to get as many vulnerable people protected as possible, I think it takes some days between the first vaccination and protection, then the sooner you get them given the first jab, the better. If they then have to wait a little while for the second one, it doesn't seem to be tragic if the advantage you get from those that more people can be vaccinated. I really can't see why anyone could object to that. All healthcare has to be rationed in some way. It's impossible to deliver it otherwise, and this seems to me to be a perfectly sensible approach if you want to maximise it, and maximising is obviously the thing that would be most effective. So no, I can't see anything wrong with that plan, I've looked at it quite carefully. I can't see why that would be an objection. My objections to the whole thing are much deeper than that. I don't object to vaccination. I just think that we are overreacting enormously to a problem which could have been dealt with far less damage to the country, and that's my main concern. But if the vaccine makes people ready to resume normal life, then I have to welcome it.
Well, yes, and obviously that's the hope. And Alison, to a certain extent, this is a race against time, isn't it? And if we turn to the front of the Metro, we get a sense of the context that this vaccine is being rolled out into. We've had the 6th day of more than 50,000 new cases in England. in a row, and now calls for tighter restrictions. Sir Keir Starmer calling for a national lockdown within 24 hours, and Boris Johnson also talking about possibly bringing in tighter restrictions.
Yeah, and this applies obviously to England. Northern Ireland, we went into a really strict lockdown on Boxing Day. So we've just had a week where there was actually a curfew in place from 8 until 6. And everywhere apart from essential retail is now closed down. There was a debate over whether schools would start back, and schools are now not going to start back until January the 11th. And if you look at most of the front pages tomorrow, that's what they're looking at, the fact that in England, people are still expected to send their children to school tomorrow, and the advice on that is conflicting. So people need proper information. Is it safe for their children to be there? Is it safe for teaching staff, you know, the canteen staff, everybody else involved in that, the people involved in transporting the children? And all of that needs answered. We had a lot of problems here in Northern Ireland with that because the Education Minister wanted the children at school, and I can understand why, because vulnerable children suffer most when they're left at home, especially children who can't afford laptops and devices to do online learning. And we have to really be mindful of the damage that's already been caused to those children's education over the last 10 months. But right now, the cases here are so high, and I think that that's reflected elsewhere as well. They're not coming down. They're going the opposite direction. They're going up. And you can understand why some parents are at this point in time confused as to whether or not they should or should not be sending their children to school tomorrow morning.
Well, yes, and Peter, if we look at the front of the Daily Star, they're picking a fight, if you like, with Boris Johnson over his statement today that schools were safe. He said that if people were in areas where schools were due to open tomorrow, they should send their children there. What do you make of the schools debate? There are various councils and individual schools in some cases choosing to close from tomorrow because they're not comfortable with the situation. Do you have some sympathy for them?
Not really. The government has made it a hard bed for itself to lie on by spreading consistently for the past 9 months fear and panic about this virus. And it's not surprising if people believe what the government says, but the language that we use, we talk about cases of COVID. They're not cases, they're positive tests. And in many cases, even the government's own material concedes that 1 in 3 of these supposed cases have no symptoms. I suspect it's higher than that, and where there are symptoms, in many cases, they're not particularly great. There's also the huge question of classification. What are we classifying as COVID? Is the classification accurate? It's extraordinary the way that both influenza and pneumonia have practically disappeared from the sickness statistics this autumn and winter, when they'd normally be quite high. And I actually dug out on Saturday for my Mail on Sunday column a story about the overloads of the NHS and huge numbers of people having cancelled operations and people queuing up in ambulances and all the things which are happening. And I pointed out this had taken place almost exactly 3 years ago, when we had also had a very serious, as we have in many years in England certainly, NHS overload because of the great reduction in beds which has been achieved by both the Labour and Conservative parties over the past 20 years. And are we actually making a drama out of a crisis?
But can you call it that? Sorry, Peter, to interrupt.
The way people talk and think. Are the schools safe? I mean, but my suspicion is that they probably are. And Amanda Spielman, the head of Ofsted, the chief inspector of schools in England, has very much said that it's terribly damaging that children should stay away from school. But it's very difficult to persuade people of that if at the same time you're trying to tell them that there's a terrible plague at large, which is threatening us on a terrifying and unprecedented scale. If that's true, then you can't really be surprised if people say, I don't want to send my children to school.
But Peter, more than 75,000 people have died having had a positive coronavirus test within 28 days. That's a huge number of people.
That's true, yes, but that doesn't mean that they've died. As Jenny Harris, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, pointed out last April, these figures do not mean that people have died of COVID. They may have died with it. And the whole, Dr. John Lee, the distinguished pathologist, has said that he's astonished at the unreliability of the death figures which you've had. Because people have died, and there's no doubt that COVID is a serious disease, which many people died from during the April-May period, and it was, I think, quite badly mishandled in several ways. Are we actually making it out to be bigger and more dangerous than it is. And my analogy for what we're doing is we're like a man who discovers he has a wasp's nest in his house and burns down his house to get rid of the wasp nest. The measures which we're taking are
Okay.
so huge that they're completely out of proportion to the problem we face.
Alison.
I think that the problem is that there's nothing equal, about this pandemic. It has never been equal. We have never all been in the same boat together. And the problem is the children, while we know that they're not greatly affected by it in terms of the illness they receive, we do know that they carry it. And children who come from poor households, they not only suffer the fact that their education has suffered, but also their children who are likely to live in very cramped housing, the children who are very likely to have to rely on grandparents or older relatives to look after them while their parents work in very front public-facing jobs. And so the issue is, I think, that most people would like answered is, while my child may not be at risk personally, will they carry it back to maybe a grandparent who has been left behind and while their mother has to go and work in a supermarket or wherever else? And that's the problem, because we can see that the figures for coronavirus are so much higher in areas where people live in economic deprivation, and that is for very good reasons. It's because those people cannot stay at home and work from home. It's because they live in cramped housing. It's because they rely on older relatives to provide their childcare because they can't afford creches. And so if the schools are going to go back, then who is picking those children up after school, and will that lead to a rise in increased cases in some areas?
Okay, we must pause there. Sorry to cut you off, Peter.
I could say there's another element to it as well.
Very briefly.
If you're living in a house with one small computer or maybe one mobile phone, and you're trying to educate your child remotely on that, it's very different than if you're living in a house with 3 or 4 computers, laptop per child. This is hugely disadvantaging poor households, and the destruction of the education of the children of the poor is a terrible and lengthening disaster which this country will pay for many years to come.
Yeah, so many issues. Sorry to cut you off. We're just very late for the break, which we will take now. Lots more issues coming up, though, very shortly. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me tonight, Peter Hitchens and Alison Morris, taking us through tomorrow's stories. And Alison, front page of the Financial Times, they lead with coronavirus in the UK, but their second story focuses on Donald Trump and what's happening this week. Talk us through it.
Well, I mean, I don't know about you, but I think we were all glued to the American elections. It was a bit of relief, wasn't it, from coronavirus here on the news? But they're having, obviously, the Senate runoffs. And at this point in time, a Democrat who's never been elected before, never held office, Raphael Warnock, who would be the first black person elected in Georgia, looks set to beat the Republican candidate, which is going to be yet another blow for Donald Trump. This obviously comes in the back of the tape that has been released tonight, which shows which we can hear Donald Trump talking to one of the chief electoral agents in Georgia, trying to convince them to find extra votes that may not exist, and discussing what has happened to machines in that state. That's one of the states that has been traditionally held by Republicans to lose ground in such a heavy Republican area, something that Donald Trump clearly doesn't want to leave office knowing. But I mean, I think this is interesting. It shows a change in voter patterns in that area. And I think it just follows on from, the upset in relation to the American elections that we've already had. Donald Trump is still tweeting as though he is the president and as though he has won the election, and still seems determined not to leave the White House. Although I think his road has he's run out of road at this stage in relation to that. But this is a big blow for him, and I think coming back of that sort of exclusive tape that was released earlier today, I think this is, it's going to make for a much bigger story tomorrow as this unfolds.
Well, yes, do you agree with that, Peter? And what impact could that have, do you think, on voters?
Well, I'm not terribly interested in the fate of Donald Trump. He's obviously gone and passed. But if the Senate passes to the Democrats, then it is a huge development, particularly with a Vice President, Kamala Harris, who's very left-wing and quite possibly may succeed at some point during this presidency. We cannot tell, but we have a very old president. There are a lot of the Democratic Party in recent years has become much more of a dogmatically left-wing party than it ever was before. And Republicans have consoled themselves by saying, well, that's all very well, but with a Republican-controlled Senate, nothing will really happen. The president hasn't got that much power. The Senate can block him. But if you have now a Democrat-controlled Senate and a Democrat-controlled House of Representatives and a Democratic White House, you could have an extremely left-wing and how shall I say, radical government in the United States of the kind which nobody really expected
OK, I'm cutting you off because we're out of time. We thought we might talk about a search for scallywag bunkers, but we might have to say that's the next hour. I'll see you both at 11:30, but for the moment, thank you both very much indeed.